Welcome to week 17, Establish a Million. Drew, we've made it through a full regular season. Believe it or not, the end is here. So I went to write a recap for week 16, and honestly, it feels so long ago. I don't even know what happened in week 16.
I'm trying to remember if I played. I think I played. I probably lost. But yeah.
I mean, if you don't remember, we probably didn't do very well.
I definitely didn't win. It's just whether I played and lost or whether I didn't play. But I think I played a few lineups. Yeah, it's everything. The last 2 weeks has just been a mind meld between NBA starting and blowouts every single night in that sport, and NFL coming to its conclusion, and now being given a list of names that I recognize half of them to choose a cover boy for.
So here we are. So in light of our short-term amnesia, we won't do really a recap from last week, but I think it would be nice to go through some high-level takeaways from the year. Drew, you're prepared for this. If you looked at our outline, if you didn't, you're going to have to answer these on the fly. So we'll find out.
I'm always prepared, whether I looked at the outline or not.
So one thing you did right this year, one thing you did wrong or would like to do better, and one thing, maybe you learned that you didn't expect. And I can go first if you need some time.
No. We can go. What are we alternating? Are we just going all three at once?
We could alternate. Let's go okay. A little what you did right. Like, prop yourself up here.
So I think the thing that I did right this year in general was I think I really strongly emphasized correlation in a way that I haven't done to a certain extent in past years. And I think that early in the season, that was extremely beneficial when pricing was taking some time to adjust and the pricing was a little bit softer, and I was able to attack situations that were undervalued relative to the market, like the Cowboys passing game. I think that was some of the stuff that I did best, and I think it was most applicable kind of early and in the middle part of the season.
As I'm looking at your leverage article from the week, I have it up on the screen. You can see that Drew, if you look at his finish positions by percentile buckets, had way more teams than you would expect based on randomness in the top 1% bucket, which is like essentially is what you're trying to do. And the rest is sort of variance. And Drew kind of wrote how I believe you had
I lost
negative ROI this season with that. Yeah. So that kind of just speaks to the variance of an NFL season. But if you're trying to be process over results, you did what you were supposed to do. And I think that correlation probably helped you. It also does. I finally do remember last week a little bit now thinking about this because Houston, Tennessee went off, and I'll talk about that. Houston, Cincinnati. Yeah. Houston, Tennessee is this week, and I'm already having nightmares about the game.
You're predicting the future.
So I'll talk about that and what I did wrong a little bit more. That'll be some macro and some micro there last week. But what I did right, I think I wasn't afraid to play contrarian. I really felt like this year there were a lot of spots where you could easily get scared and play super chalky, and I didn't. And I was rewarded. Or I should say, when I was rewarded, I won big, as Drew says quite often. What do you win when you win? And I think I was building the right contrarian teams for the right field sizes. I was really focusing on winning tournaments without having to be perfect. And the way to do that was to be pretty contrarian, maybe even more so than people thought was correct, in about the 200-man field sizes that I was playing a lot of. So I was happy with my stomach for that throughout the course of the season. Of course, it's easier to have that stomach when you have success early, which I did. Had I not had success early, would I have been able to hold to that approach? I don't know, if the season was sort of flipped on its head, because we had some chalkier, less correlated teams winning the latter half of the season. It might have broke me some if the order of events was different, but luckily it wasn't. So I was happy with that. So Drew, what's one thing you did wrong this season?
I think my biggest mistake this season is I did not spend enough time working through my single entry and 3-max and kind of higher stakes GPP teams. Most of my top 1% and top 0.01% finishes came through MME, and I spent a lot of time crafting my MME fields and rules and different things like that. But oftentimes my single entry 3-max, like my higher stakes GPP teams would sort of be the last thing I thought of during the week. And that's okay if it's still enough time to really digest it and kind of come up with a strategy. And I felt a little bit rushed in terms of the way that I handled those things this year. And I think that's a big part of the reason for me having a losing year is even amidst the majority of my overall kind of profile of finishes being quite good, it's that the higher stake stuff I was, really bad in this year. And I think I just hadn't dedicated enough time. I know you are only doing kind of those types of teams, but you do a lot of that work on Saturday night, really thinking and honing in on your teams and having like teams before you go to bed. And I don't. And I'm usually working up late on my rules and groups and different things like that. And so I think that's one area of possible improvement for me, certainly going forward.
I'm curious if you think that in terms of trying to improve on that going forward, how feasible you see that being with the bulk of your playing being MME. I think like as DFS has gone on, I've kind of seen, some value in being, I don't necessarily want to say a specialist, because I think we want to be well-rounded, but like for me, like flipping it, I focus on those small field tournaments. I've MME'd maybe 3 or 4 times this year when I saw like a specific opportunity. Do you think it's viable for you to that week in and week out, or do you think maybe it's
I do. The big thing for me is that I just need to start a little bit earlier in terms of managing my groups and rules. And then I don't need to run my MME sets until Sunday morning when I get inactives and whatnot. But I'm setting up my groups and rules and everything Saturday night. If I had that done during the week, which there's plenty of time to do that during the week, and just like adjust a few things here or there, and then spend Saturday night dedicated to thinking through kind of my higher stakes GPP entries, I think that'll be a much better process for me.
Yeah, groups and rules are, those aren't, it's not like those are changing a ton on news throughout the week. Like you might have to alter 1 or 2, but for the most part, they're almost, very similar each week. So that makes a lot of sense. For me, I think one thing I did wrong was, sometimes your greatest strength is your greatest weakness. And I talked about not being afraid to play contrarian, but I think at times when there was chalk with really high ceiling, sometimes I didn't focus on the ceiling aspect of things. I think there's 2 parts that are really important to being a GPP player. You do want to find the correct leverage spots, but you also want to focus on a really high ceiling. And I think at times I overlooked, that part of things. And last week, good example that Houston-Cincinnati game, we knew had a high ceiling. T. Higgins was our top wide receiver value. Houston games in general, we even talked, Drew, you even talked about it at the beginning of the show last week about how, he likes to attack games involving Houston, because even though that game the week prior when I played Houston, Indianapolis in the final didn't work out, like you could see how it could have gotten there, how the pace could have got there. And it got there. I mean, as someone who was fading the Houston Cincinnati game last week, I was like, oh my God, stop it. Because it was just like a quick scoring possession after quick scoring possession. And Justin Herzig is a player that I've come to know through the Fantasy Football World Series. He had a massive week last week. Not only did he take down Underdog's Best Ball Mania tournament, but he won some, 6 figures on FanDuel last week. And on DraftKings, he had a similar construction where he had Watson with David Johnson, Brandon Cooks, bring back T. Higgins. A pretty simple stack. We're generally not stacking our running backs, but I think given that David Johnson was coming off a 10-catch game, like that was viable. And it's just something that seems so obvious to me. And I just didn't really think about it because I was like, that game's going to be too owned. And I kind of moved on and didn't focus on the ceiling enough. And there are going to be high owned players that have really high ceilings that you have to fade because they're too high owned. So I don't want to make it sound overly simplistic, but I do want to focus on that component a little bit more going forward.
Yeah, I feel like that game, while it had some ownership last week, I never felt like T. Higgins or David Johnson were in the category of maybe being like 40% owned. I thought those guys are like topping out at like 25. And Cooks, I thought, was like topping out at like 15 to 18. And yeah, there's like that's decent ownership on that game as a whole, but I feel like that's ownership that you can still deal with. Like we were playing Cowboys Seahawks stuff at that type of ownership earlier in the year.
And that's a really good point, because a couple of times earlier in the year when I did win, it was focusing on the ceiling that was provided by those matchups in those games and not worrying about it being like a super low owned game stack. across the board. Real quick, this is a micro question, but is that a spot with DJ you wouldn't pay attention to the correlation? I don't know. I don't know if I would have played it. I think it makes sense. A guy just coming off a 10-catch game, that it works out. But like we continue to see too, when games go off, like everyone kind of goes off. You know, we've seen this with Tennessee and Derrick Henry and AJ Brown when they're not correlated. But like, I don't know. That's something I need to think through a little bit more. In general, I just feel like there's so much opportunity cost at running back that I have trouble seeing those guys seeing their ceilings together. But you know, DJ caught a touchdown on a play that was a designed pass play to him. He was lined up out wide. It was like a goal line slant.
Ran a slant, yeah. I would have throughout the year, I have had rules with Deshaun Watson and David Johnson that is trying to reduce exposure to them in the same lineup. I think after seeing the double-digit target game the week before, I would have loosened up those rules, especially with the lack of receiving options that they kind of have on the offense in general, just through sheer attrition. I think I would have loosened up those rules. I would have at worst had a correlation on it, a negative correlation on it, where it's like lineups that include Deshaun Watson decrease David Johnson's projection. But David Johnson was a really strong play last week. And I think many times during the course of the year, he's been an play. And so I've been limiting correlation on that. And that is reminding me, I didn't MME last week. I just created a few hand-build lineups, which is another frustrating aspect of last week for me, because the Houston-Cincinnati game would have been a game I would have had a lot of in MME is my guess, just based on the way that I play. But I didn't land on it. I landed on mini correlations of it in 2 of my 3 lineups, but not the full kind of game stack.
All right. So what's one thing you learned that maybe you didn't expect to learn, you know, heading into the year?
Yeah, I think the thing that this game that we're trying to play is so difficult to analyze because it's constantly changing and evolving. And it's really hard to try to make sure that you're ahead of the curve on the analysis that you're providing in a way that provides people an edge. And as the game continues to evolve further and further, you need to think through things in a different way. And I think the thing that I did not expect to learn during the second half of the season was like how quickly the game would evolve in terms of people using more correlation tricks and tools to be emphasized there, and how some of the tournaments that I was playing, the emphasis was switching a little bit away from correlation and more to pure ceiling. And I think that was something that I've had difficulty kind of adapting to at different points in the season. I want to think through it a little bit more in the off season in terms of ways that I can recognize slates that might be more appropriate for that and slates that might be more rewarded for pure correlation plays. I think it's really difficult to diagnose up front. But stuff around that, I didn't expect to be writing at different points in the season about how you might want to scale back some of the correlation to emphasize upside in different spots. And some of that is just because it's getting played more aggressively by the field. Some of that is the pricing on the sites and kind of how games were working out. I need to think through it more in terms of being able to better diagnose it going forward. But that's the big thing that surprised me during the course of the season, is some of the approaches really had to adapt in season for success.
Yeah, I think for me, I felt like there were a couple of things I sort of relearned. You know, the question is supposed to be things that you didn't expect, but there are a couple of things that I felt like I relearned that I expected, but I relearned them. One of them being, you know, your mix of players in terms of ownership. You know, a 38% owned player and a 2% owned player is better than 20% owned players. And I think I really saw that some weeks at the top of the leaderboard. And you know, assuming an equal projection on those combinations, you'd rather have the 38 and the 2 than the 20 and the 20. And I think that's something, again, that like I got like so focused sometimes on fading that 38% owned guy that I got away from like some probably pretty plus EV combinations where I could have had a low owned guy with that. So learning that, and like relearning also that if you're playing correctly, you're going to have weeks you're just going to lose. You know, it's always something you tell yourself, but
and for some of us, seasons.
And for some of you, seasons, although I think your season was pretty good, even though I know it didn't come out plus on the ROI section. And if we look at Drew's history in NFL, pretty positive history there. So looking good there. And then like a real micro thing, but just for me in particular, I think the way I play, like being very contrarian, a game selection concept that I would have never considered in the past that I'm thinking through next year is maybe playing some more of the satellite winner take all stuff, where I can kind of on specific weeks, not every week, but on specific weeks where I know I'm really contrarian, or I know there's a way to get off a build with maybe 3 mega high owned guys, and I need to find a contest to make the reward worth the risk of fading all 3 of those guys. Satellites and winner takes all are those types of contests. Not something that'll be a big part of my game, not something I'll do every week, but it is something I'm going to look into a little bit more and try and have a more, I guess, adapted bankroll strategy based on the outline of specific weeks.
Yeah, and I think that's going to really be a next evolution in DFS in general, is instead of playing the same contest every single week and kind of adapting your strategy to that contest, starting by kind of adapting, like looking at the slate and saying, okay, what is the thing that I feel like on this slate is the thing that I feel most confident in? And some weeks it's going to be away from the chalk, and some weeks it's going to be into the chalk, in terms of where your level of confidence is, and just kind of shifting and adapting your contest selection based on those things, I think is probably important. I know there's weeks that we've talked on here, Mike, where you've been like, I think in MME, this guy's going to be under-owned, but in my stakes, he's going to be really over-owned. And those types of like commentary should maybe be indications of, instead of like adapting our strategies to the contest, maybe adapt our contests to the ways that we want to play on a given week.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you to Marvin for the kind note about learning a lot this year. And Alan's mistake, usually do my 3 maxes Sunday too hungover. So Alan, there's a pretty quick fix for that one. It's the risk worth the reward.
Start drinking on Fridays instead.
Okay, let's get into this week. The theme of this week is rest, and like motivation, I should say. And that was the title of Levitan's article this week, Week 17 Motivation. It's a really awesome article. I'm always amazed at how well Adam is able to convey this information very concisely and very directly, as me and Drew can sometimes be wordy at times. So Adam does a great job of that, and it's really helped. So essentially, the teams that look like they're going all out this week, Drew: the Dolphins, Ravens, Browns, Colts, probably the Titans. Some weird events could happen where the Titans playing at 4:00. The game could matter a little bit less or not matter, but they would need like the Ravens and Dolphins to lose at a minimum, and at a maximum, the Ravens, Colts, and Dolphins all to lose, which seems unlikely. So they're probably going all out, but the Rams, Giants, Bears, and Cardinals, and probably the Packers, because they win, they get the 1 seed for sure. It's like,
I can't imagine the Packers aren't going all out. I mean, a first round bye is a huge benefit.
Teams that are like kind of like next level trying, the Seahawks and the Saints, because they do have technically a chance at that bye that Drew just mentioned, but they would need the Packers to lose. So it's like a little bit of, it's not control your own destiny.
Yeah, and the Seahawks would need the Packers and the Saints to lose.
Right. So some risk with those teams that, kind of like even a tier down. The Buccaneers, like, really don't have much to play for it. So the 5th seed or the 6th seed, Bruce Arians says they're not resting their guys, but as Levitan notes in his article, we can't.
Noted liar, Bruce Arians.
Yeah. So that one's risky. And then the teams that like really don't care and are resting guys are Chiefs have already announced rest for multiple guys. Steelers have Big Ben already as out. They haven't, I think, ruled out anybody else technically. The Bills haven't said anything, but based on what they did last year, based on the talk, I know Joe Buscaglia, who covers the Bills, is projecting Stephon Diggs and Josh Allen to be straight up inactive for this game. If they aren't, I don't think they play more than a quarter. So I think these are 3 pretty extreme rest scenarios. And with the Chiefs and Bills in particular, there could be some value that arises from that. And then everybody else is in the eliminated bucket, where that usually means they play somewhat normal, but like there's always a little bit of risk type of thing. So keep that in mind as we go to our stack section. Two very high total games this week, Drew: Minnesota, Detroit, and Houston, Tennessee. What do you think about these games?
Well, the first thing, coming off kind of describing what teams have to play for, the first thing I think of is the two higher total games on the slate have only one team of the four that has anything to play for at all. The other teams are all in sort of evaluation mode at this point in the season. And, with Detroit and Minnesota, we haven't seen them flip the switch to any sort of evaluation stuff. I mean, Minnesota was playing their normal guys last week. We know Dalvin Cook is out this week for a personal matter. And so it does open up, especially with how poorly Detroit has played defensively all year, it does open up a lot of opportunity for that game. But it is a game that I would say has a little bit of an unknown to it, just because the teams really have nothing to benefit. And Matthew Stafford has been so banged up and like limping to the finish line in the season. He's, left last week's game early, and that could certainly impact the quality of that game. Houston, Tennessee is, like, for me, it's just another spot where, I guess the other part I'll mention is, in terms of some of these non-contending teams, there are teams like Houston, and I'm blanking on the other team right now. Houston and another team with an interim coach, Atlanta. Houston and Atlanta are two teams with interim coaches that
Detroit as well.
Detroit as well, right? But Detroit's a little bit different, I guess. But yeah, Detroit as well, where the interim coaches have had like a long season to kind of build up their resume, but also like have done well enough. Like I think Romeo Crennel and Raheem Morris have done well enough that they've earned consideration. I know Raheem Morris was getting officially interviewed for the head coaching position this week. And so those situations, I actually think they're going to play the games fairly normal. Detroit is the interim coach situation is just less tenured, so I don't know, but it would make sense that.
Yeah, I don't think Detroit's hiring. Bell, is it?
Yeah, it would make sense though that those guys are using that opportunity to showcase their talents, because everybody's trying to showcase their talents in the best way possible. And similarly, there are some situations where, like the Chargers, where the players are coming out in support of Anthony Lynn in like a big way, like this last week, which is surprising to me given like how clear it's been they've underperformed their talent. But I think these types of situations might be more stable than other situations where like the coach is really stable, the team is bad, and they're just looking to get through the rest of the season. So Tennessee Houston is a game that I still am interested in quite a bit.
Yeah, the Detroit game is hard because, as you mentioned with Stafford, like it's hard for us to project, Stafford might leave early. Like, and I actually did project that with like Brady and some of those guys on rest, but like on straight injury stuff, it's a little bit hard. But we saw last week Marvin Jones was a great value on the 3-gamer. Levitan hates Marvin Jones, and he was doing Marvin Jones victory laps because he had a bad game after Stafford went out after 3 plays. But that is the risk. And again, Marvin Jones is not like a spry chicken there. So, who knows if they rest him a little bit. Price tag is really good, but I think he's going to be pretty owned in this game. I like, if you want to play the younger guys, though, it's pretty easy to play Swift and Hawkinson. I suspect we see the Hawkinson ownership a little bit higher than we have it. We have it a little bit higher on FanDuel. But Swift seems like a really good spot in the mid-tier. I know our projection runs a little bit hot, but the usage for Swift last week was really strong. 68% of the snaps, but he got 67% of the team's carries, 16% target share. We've seen him utilized in the red zone. So I like Swift quite a bit if you were to stack this game. And Cousins actually, like, drew quarterbacks in a weird spot. We haven't really talked about it, but like these non-rushing quarterbacks like are priced a little bit lower, and we don't have the studs, except for Watson. We get Watson and Tannehill in the Houston Tennessee game, but Tannehill's price tag's way up there now. So if you wanted to, and there are a few stud like skill players that we'll get to that you might want to squeeze in, but like Cousins is in play, like just regular in play this week, which is kind of rare. And when a guy's regular in play who's really easy to stack, it's kind of nice. You get Justin Jefferson's going to be owned, but like Thielen seems secondary, Irv Smith seems secondary. Either of those guys is fine.
Yeah, and we do. We have Watson, we have Lamar, we have Rodgers, we have Kyler, we have Russ.
I guess we do have more guys than I was.
So there's a lot. There are high end quarterbacks, but they're all generally priced kind of appropriately, and they all come with like some level of an unknown. Not all of them, but like, Russ. There's definitely scenarios where Russ is not playing the second half. There's definitely scenarios where Lamar, like, they get so out in front that they just run the ball over and over again. There's definitely scenarios with Kyler where they get, without the rushing upside, with some concerns over injuries, that he might just be a pure pocket passer, not necessarily the type of running quarterback that we expect. So I think this week, even though we have some of the names on the sheet and on the slate, I think it's a better week for cheap quarterbacks than we've had in a while. And some of that is the pricing related stuff that you've talked about. Like, we're getting some guys on DraftKings at like 5. We haven't had, 5K quarterbacks in play in a little bit of time, but we've got like, Daniel Jones, kind of, at 5,100, Derek Carr. Like, we've got some of these 5K quarterbacks. So Cousins a little bit more expensive, but he's certainly in that mix as well.
And if you're willing to play some uncertainty, our top quarterback values are projected as unowned, these 5K guys, so if you're willing to play some correlations, like Teddy Bridgewater is an easy quarterback to correlate, Mayfield's pretty easy to correlate with. In Jarvis Landry, Rashard Higgins are 2 mid-tier receivers.
Assuming he has his wide receivers.
Yeah, assuming he has his wide receivers.
Because they had another coach test positive this morning, I guess. So who knows what's going to happen there again.
If they get Landry and Higgins back, though, it's like a team that is going all out against a team that is not tanking, but like doesn't care about the game. We've got a 9-point spread. Obviously, there's some concern they just run the ball, but things happen. We saw that last week, and they were a little bit more pass happy. They have been more pass happy the last half of the season. So that's interesting. KC with Chad Henne, one thing that's tough with like the Buffalo and KC situations are how do the coordinators call plays? Like Buffalo's these are the 2 pass happiest teams in the entire NFL, right? Do they call plays? I don't think they're going to be clearly not as pass happy, but are they close? Like, do they keep with their identity and just do that with the backup players, or are they just going to play this like really balanced, neutral kind of pass game script? But those are really interesting things to consider, because you can get Henne. I mean, he's cheap in a game that's like this KC Chargers game. I like quite a bit.
I don't like playing the unknown quarterbacks personally. For a number of reasons. One, like, they're so difficult to project because of play calling tendencies, because of who they're playing around, like offensive linemen that might not be playing in front of them, skill position players. So like, I would rather attack known quarterbacks, and you can still play those unknown situations with skill players, but I just prefer not to play them with quarterbacks, because quarterbacks are tough to separate anyway. And one way to potentially separate is playing time. And in some instances, like the Bills, for an example, like, we might not know. Like, if Josh Allen is straight inactive, we'd know, I guess. But like, couldn't it be the case that they play Matt Barkley and is Fromm healthy? Is he available?
I don't think they're also like trying to keep Fromm completely separate as the
COVID emergency.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's situations.
I guess I don't know. We'd see if he was active. I don't think he'd play. I think Barkley would play the whole game, but as you said, it's not like 100% guarantee.
I also last year went like all in on the Bills in that Jets game, and that was just so gross. It was like Duke Williams got there, but like TJ Yeldon kind of got there on some like late catches in a very cheap way, but like, that was ugly.
Games, like these games can get ugly. I'm not saying like full out stack. I just think like there are some opportunities, or at the very least, if you like the cheap pass catchers, if you want to play the quarterback, I think this Chargers Chiefs game, the Chargers you mentioned as a team that wants to play for Anthony Lynn, and in a weird way, I think Anthony Lynn takes too much heat because he's just so bad on game day, but that's all everyone sees. Like, I think that's all they think about that goes into coaching. I don't know if I'm explaining this right, but like,
right. Well,
I think he's very bad. I think he deserves to be fired, but I think he's like not as egregious as like common perception.
There's guys that are good on game day, but lead a very bad locker room, and the players end up like not wanting to play for them. And I think those are the types of things that Anthony Lynn is probably good at, given the quotes from his players that they seem to like him. But yeah.
Regardless, I mean, it's clear he deserves to be gone, and someone else needs to take that team to the next level. But if that's a pretty stackable game, and you can take some chances on cheap KC receivers. Like people are going to play Hardman, but I mean, for all we know, Byron Pringle and Demarcus Robinson are plays, right? Like, I mean, and you might think I'm not playing guys like that. Well, this is week 17 DFS. Buckle up. So I like that Chargers Chiefs game quite a bit. The quarterback situation, I think like on FanDuel, it's a little easier to play one of the more expensive quarterbacks. It's just looser pricing overall, and those guys rate as better values to begin with. Like you can see up top, like our top values on FanDuel are all guys that, like, for the most part, are pretty good. Kyler's ownership on DK looks like it's going to be extremely low, and I generally don't mess with quarterbacks that don't project well, but there's some inkling to a quarterback that has to try. It's just a really low total game, tough matchup, could be ugly. I'll say this too, Drew. I'm just preparing Drew to yell at me. John Wolford week. He can run a little bit. AAF star John Wolford. Make that stack with Josh Reynolds. Do whatever else you want elsewhere. Could happen on DraftKings. Gonna say it. All right, let's get back to like actual game stacks though. We kind of went through the quarterbacks. What do you think about Green Bay Chicago? Because that's the highest total between two teams that are both actively trying.
Yeah, I think it's reasonable to stack, but it's the Aaron Rodgers problem that I kind of always have, which has been less of an issue this year because he is throwing so many touchdowns. But in the past, my problem with Aaron Rodgers from a DFS perspective, I have a lot of problems with Aaron Rodgers outside of DFS. From a DFS perspective, my problem with Aaron Rodgers is you could get most of his production through Davante Adams. And so just like play Anthony Lynn does his 3 maxes on Sundays hungover. I appreciate that. You could get most of the Aaron Rodgers production from just playing Davante Adams. This year, Rodgers is throwing a lot of random touchdowns. So he's like really hard to double stack because like you'll get a long touchdown to MVS. You'll get a long touchdown you'll get like short touchdowns to Mercedes Lewis. I do still believe in the Rodgers MVP narrative, so I don't mind it. The challenge is like who do you stack on the other side from the Bears because Montgomery's got so expensive, and I think he would be like kind of the natural guy normally, but now you're running out like a really expensive stack without getting a ton of the game. So I think it's very much in play. I think it's just a little bit trickier on how to approach it. And you're going to have to play someone that's pretty uncomfortable, but like it's week 17, there's a lot of uncomfortable plays being made. So Marquez Valdes-Scantling is probably a better GPP play than half the guys we just ran through as uncomfortable. Like we don't really know what they're going on. We at least know that Valdes-Scantling is going to get a deep ball or two.
I like Lazard the best. I mean, this usage for MVS lately is tough. 9 targets in 5 games. For MVS with Lazard back. Lazard 21.
I mean, that whole thing, like after Devontae is just gross. It's like 14% is what we're like hoping and holding on to.
Yeah, I think Lazard's playable, at least on DraftKings. I think on FanDuel, you could just single stack it, though. With Devontae. Chicago, bring it back. So I think the price tags, as you said, aren't great on Montgomery and Robinson. But like if there's a week to eat bad price tags, like there's just a couple guys you need to foul that if Robinson and Montgomery have like good games, they could get there. If Derrick Henry doesn't do amazing, if Jonathan Taylor doesn't do amazing, only a couple guys they have to beat, I guess. But I like Cole Kmet a lot. We'll talk about him a little bit more at tight end. The secondary high total games, Jacksonville, Indianapolis, Las Vegas, Denver. I think this Indy game's interesting. One take I want to get to you on Indy, Drew. They have a super high team total. I believe it's the highest team total of the entire week, or at least up there. I think it's pretty viable to play Jonathan Taylor and a pass catcher in lineups together without Phillip Rivers this week.
Yes, I agree. I agree for a couple reasons. One, their pass catchers aren't super expensive, so you don't need like a monster game to get there. While you do need a pretty darn good game from Taylor to get there, you probably need 2 touchdowns from Jonathan Taylor to get there. Probably. I mean, he could have like 180 yards or something like that, but probably. So I think it is viable. The other part of it is, I think this is a week in week 17 where it's a little bit harder to hunt for points just in general because of all the unknown situations and the weaker players that are getting on the field more and some inept offenses that you'll see. So I think just going to sections where there's going to be points scored is totally fine. I would do it with the guys that can break big plays, which is Pittman and Hilton specifically. I don't know that I'd go beyond that. I don't know that I'd go into the tight end range because the tight end range needs the touchdowns, just like Jonathan. They kind of need the same things. But Hilton and Pittman, I think, are viable plays without Rivers with Jonathan Taylor.
Yeah, and I've done some modeling looking at expected offensive touchdowns for teams based on their team total and the overall game total. For the Colts, that comes out at 3.5 offensive touchdowns. That's a big number. Like an average of that with teams with this kind of team total and game total. So if you get 4 offensive touchdowns, which is like not that unlikely given this breakdown, there might be enough touchdowns to go around. And then on Jacksonville, the bringbacks, like there's a lot of viability in bringbacks because you've got Chris Conley out, or not, I'm sorry, not Chris Conley, Colin Johnson and DJ Chark out, which leaves you with Chris Conley, Keelan Cole, Laviska Shenault as the primary receivers. I've got some working for Terry Godwin. I'm not sure who it would be. Also want to point out, like on some of these teams, the Bills, the Chiefs, there might be guys that play that we don't have projected for volume because they're on the practice squad right now, or we just would have never assumed they would play. So there's always a little bit of fragility sometimes on these guys that seem like, oh, there's all this volume that's going to go to them. And it's like, oh, practice squad hero played the fourth quarter. But
and James Robinson out obviously for the Jags as well, which is a guy who's eaten up most of their volume during the year.
Yes, and I don't think I would play Dare, but I really don't think I'd play Dare. But I do, I have to point out the crappy running back volume. He played 71% of snaps, 88% of the team's carries with 5 targets last week. If you want a gross play that no one's going to play, bring back check down Dare. But I think Chenault's going to be the highest owned receiver, I think, for good reason. But I don't know. I think he's going to be too over-owned relative to Cole and Conley, and even Eifert at tight end, that you could, really leverage Shenault with a cheap pass catcher. It's also a game too. If you thought got nutty, like you could really do 2 guys from each side of it and like have a game stack. And like if you want to play in small field, limit the amount of things you get right. Like you could have 2 Colts, 2 Jags, and then like have a second game stack with it with your quarterback, and like essentially have a lineup that's just 2 game stacks.
Yeah, I probably won't play 2 Jags, but I think Keelan Cole is a good tournament play there. He's the guy that I like most of that list.
So what other games are you looking at? Those are the high total games.
Well, there's Denver and Las Vegas that we didn't.
Yeah, that's in this tier. Sorry, I mentioned that and then we didn't go into detail. So yes, going to Vegas and Denver
in that game, and it's interesting to me. The total feels, I don't know, the total feels high to me in general, but maybe I'm just like,
it's how Vegas has been all year.
Maybe I'm just underestimating what these Raiders games have been, because they've been pretty consistently heavy scoring affairs. But if you think this is going to live up to the total, there's plays here because everybody's pretty affordable. We talked about last week, Jerry Jeudy and KJ Hamler were both sub 4K on DraftKings, and then Hamler got hurt last week. Jeudy had all the opportunity in the world, had like double-digit targets, dropped a touchdown. Melvin Gordon, I think he's like the same play as last week, just people are frustrated that it didn't work last week, and so now you're not getting nearly as much ownership on it. But the Raiders are a worse defense, in my opinion, than the Chargers. And so I think Melvin Gordon is still in play. And There's going to be a need for raw points. And at tight end, Darren Waller is going to be the guy that has the biggest ceiling at the position by a wide margin with no Kelsey on the slate. I guess Mark Andrews, you could say, but like Waller's shown a ceiling that's just different. So I don't know. I think Las Vegas and Denver are like a viable game stack that I don't think anybody's playing because nobody's playing the quarterbacks, and Carr rates is a pretty good value for us.
Yeah.
So,
I think Judy's going to get some ownership after the 15 target game last week. That's always tough to project. The game log's super gross. The target share the last 4 weeks for Judy is, not last 5 games or whatever. It's not that good for Judy, but we do have Hamler out for them. It's a 20% target share, but that's with a 15 target game baked in. So it's kind of like, do you project him at like 25% target share because he just had a 15 target game, or do you project him right at 20% and assume, that was kind of an aberration, but the low target games are an aberration as well. So we have him projecting kind of behind the market and some other receivers. But I do think that Melvin Gordon is a wider range of outcome guys than people realize, which is what happens with, the rushing efficiency touchdown guys. We've seen it with guys who are much better than him in that profile, like Derrick Henry and Nick Chubb. But that's what Melvin Gordon's been all season. He's actually had a decent bit of efficiency. So when he gets over 100 yards, when he gets in the box, you can see a ceiling, but you also see a 0 target game, and that happens too. The targets just aren't great there. I wouldn't expect it to be 0 again, but it's not great.
Adam, so here's my question for you. On DraftKings, Adam has Darren Waller in like the 9 to 12% range for ownership right now. I'm just thinking about like the slate and the way that the pricing is. I cannot imagine anyone playing him.
So the reason why people might play him, and we'll see, but like I don't think he would get much over 11%. But the reason I could see people playing him, if you want to fade like Devontae Adams or Derrick Henry, like some of these guys, you have a lot of salary very quickly, especially with some of the cheap guys. If people want to play Laviska Shenault and Josh Reynolds, you've quickly got a lot of salary. That almost makes me like Waller because that's kind of the way. Because sometimes it's hard. As when I was building lineups, the difficulty I had was, I can't really get too contrarian because I just have nowhere to spend. I can't fill out the cap. I can't fill up enough points. And one way to kind of combat that would be to play, a very expensive tight end with a pretty high.
Yeah, it just felt like to me whether even if you fade Adams and Henry, I understand you still have a lot of salary left, but you could still play like the Justin Jefferson crowd, the like Adam Thielen crowd. I like Jonathan Taylor, David Montgomery. Like I don't know. I feel like tight end is going to be a spot that people are like, I'm not paying $7,000 for non-Travis Kelce.
Yeah, maybe we'll see. It just there's, when the market talks themselves into playing Laviska Shenault and Malcolm Brown a ton.
Yeah,
there's cheap quarterbacks viable that we mentioned. I guess it'll swing too, depending on what people do at quarterback. But there's routes to get up there without it being that difficult. But it certainly won't be people's primary read. As far as other stacks, anything else you like this week? I know like Seattle, San Francisco has some appeal, but there's obviously the uncertainty on Seattle's effort.
Yeah, I'm not in on that because I think you could get a receiver from Seattle, and I think you can get pieces from San Francisco certainly, but I think to get Russ's ceiling, if he does it in a half, then I don't think he's going to be playing the second half. And I don't know that he can do it in a half. And that's my concern. I think they're going to have a clear distinction on the scoreboard that, I think they'll play into the third quarter, but I think they're going to have a clear distinction on the scoreboard that they don't need to play the fourth.
Yeah. So I think, that's something to look into, is whether or not you believe they play the full game.
They just need one of New Orleans or Green Bay to be playing from well ahead.
Right. But you also got a coach that's a little dull.
Okay. Moving on.
The opposite of sharp. It's dull. So if he just plays him because he's, whatever. I don't know. The appeal here, though, is I do think there's some upside on the San Francisco side on Kittle and Richie James and Jeff Wilson. I think these guys have actually pretty high ceilings individually. I don't know how much they get there together, though.
Yeah.
So I think that's about it for me as far as stacks. Like, as I mentioned, I really like the Chargers, KC.
I think Tampa Bay, Atlanta has some viability to it.
Well, who? Yeah, just stacking Ryan and one pass catcher.
Well, no, I think you could stack Brady. We saw Brady deliver a performance and a half last week.
That seems like recency bias to say Brady can do it in a half.
No, but I also don't think if the game is competitive, I think they're playing all the way through, because I think playing the NFC East division winner is a big difference but I mean, it's Bruce Arians, so who knows? But that I do think that game is viable, just because it's a lot of pass attempts for whenever they're playing their normal way.
Yeah. The thing that I always say with Ryan, and I see a lot of sharp players do it, even though he doesn't project that well for us. Keep in mind, the values are particularly tight this week at quarterback. When he hits, you know who hits, right? And I think that is super valuable to have an easy double, particularly on DK. It's Ridley, Hurst, Gage. It's the only guys you need to worry about. You play 2 of those guys. You can play 3 of them in some circumstances, if you really think it goes off, because that's how concentrated it's going to be. All right, let's move on. We've spent a lot of time so far already, so let's go good chalk, bad chalk. We'll go through pretty quickly then. Quickly for us. Ownership, Derrick Henry, Jonathan Taylor. These are the 2 high-owned studs at the position, both in really good matchups, both seemingly needing to win. Again, Tennessee, there's some routes to where they don't need to win, but it's a little bit thin. So I think they're going to be mega owned. And then Malcolm Brown on DraftKings is going to be super owned. Just really hard for him not to have a decent game based on the volume we're expecting. We'll have to see if Cam Akers is indeed out. It seems really unlikely he'll play, but not officially ruled out. If they don't have him, they have, I believe, Xavier Jones and Raymond Calais behind. And I don't know. We could see 100% of the running back touches go to Malcolm Brown in this game. Yeah. On FanDuel, a couple the backups that just their games are better suited for FanDuel, and their prices are way better on FanDuel are Latavius Murray and Alexander Madison.
Yeah, I think those guys are all decent chalk on the sites that you're talking. I like Brown more on DraftKings than I do on FanDuel, because I do think he'd catch more passes. But I do think in general, running back on a team with an 18 team total is pretty fragile chalk, just in general. So I would say Brown is a little bit more fragile. My question to you on Henry, and this applies to Henry and Adams this week, is a lot of weeks we talk about how players at these price tags need so much to really bury you that it's almost always okay to fade them, because there's lots of ways that as long as they don't get 40, that you can still kind of come back. This week, because there's less depth at those secondary spends, do you feel the same way, or do you feel differently that the bar on them burying you is a little bit different because of the nuances of week 17?
No, I think the bar is lower. I think there are less studs that are going to play full games that are going to put up these ceiling performances, and conversely, there's more cheap guys that could get the volume and get to 20 points to fill out. If Henry gets to 26, doesn't seem great for tournaments, but if Gabriel Davis or Laviska Shenault score 18, you're right back in business. So I'm leaning towards being a little bit chalkier with my studs this week. Again, kind of channeling what we talked about, how the 38% and a 2% owned is better than a 20% owned and a 20% owned. Kind of channel that methodology. And really, trying to focus on this. I think the ceiling on Henry and Taylor is incredible. That I might have some teams with them together. On another week, I probably would say don't play these two together. Just play one. I think I'll have some together. I probably won't have all three of Henry, Taylor, Malcolm Brown on DraftKings. I think that's going to be a super, super chalky build. So I would probably max two of those three together. But other than that, I'll play him. And I think FanDuel, that third guy, gets spread out enough that you can be solo owned at receiver and tight end this week that I'm okay being pretty chalky at running back.
Yeah, I think that's important to note. I think Henry is really, really likely to rush for over 100 and score once, and I think he's decently likely to score twice. I think him and Adams this week are very, very tough fades, I think.
So, yeah, the Malcolm Brown thing is tough for me because I think, like, broadly speaking, as you said, a running back on an 18-team total is going to be mega chalk. Like, that's pretty easy fade. But damn if this workload isn't better than a lot of these other guys behind him. So that one's a tough one for me as well. But I'd probably lean to fading him more of the group and just hope to get lucky on
here. I guess let me put it to you this way. Okay. How confident do you think in the difference between the workload for Dare Ogunbowale and Malcolm Brown is?
So how confident the difference?
The difference. Like, how confident are you that Malcolm Brown has a lot more opportunities than Dare Ogunbowale?
I think my confidence level in Malcolm Brown's touches is way higher than my confidence level in Dare's touches, but
okay. Because we said, like, Dare had like this monster workload last week, right? And the Jags have a 17.5 implied total. So like, in terms of offenses, there's not that big of a difference in terms of implied success rate. I know we think of the Rams as one that is normally generating a lot more high value running back touches because of their usage in the red zone and whatnot. But if they're not getting those red zone opportunities, how big of a difference is Malcolm Brown from Dare Ogunbowale? That's like how I'm thinking of.
Yeah, there's certainly routes. There's just also a lot of routes like, you mentioned that red zone. I'll pull up the red zone. And as you said, they might not get to the red zone, but like if they do get there, they're going to jam that ball. They're going to run the ball. And this is the pass rate above expectation. The Rams have the third highest rush rate above expectation in the red zone. No, I think it's probably the right fade. I just I don't think it's quite as simple. Like, I'm probably playing semantics a little bit. After watching Levitan ask like 6 leading questions on the show last night regarding Malcolm Brown.
You weren't prepared for my Dare Ogunbowale comp.
No, I was expecting you to make fun of me for Dare. I even had it in the notes. Like, Drew, leave me alone. I need to talk about the volume. Like,
that's fine. And if I guess the difference between you and I is you like have a little bit of appeal for Dare Ogunbowale, and so then my case about him being similar to Malcolm Brown is not a detractor for your Malcolm Brown love.
I don't really have an appeal for Dare though. This is how the tables get turned. I'm an information gatherer. I'm an aggregator. I'm a communicator. I'm a transmitter. Wide receiver talk. Davante Adams. So if you had to choose between Davante and Derrick Henry,
I would choose Davante on DraftKings.
Okay, I think I'd choose Henry, but I don't have anything super impressive.
Yeah, I think I'd choose Davante on DraftKings. Henry maybe on FanDuel, but I think with Davante,
the Rodgers and the Bears have ruined you.
Both of those things are true, certainly. I don't know how that relates to DFS, but both of those are true, that they have ruined me. I just think that I feel very confident that Green Bay is going all out this game, and I feel very confident that Rodgers is behaving the exact way he's behaved like the last 5 weeks, which is a lot of throwing in the red zone and a lot of throwing to Davante Adams, and the Bears are down some corners as well. So I think it's a really, really good spot for Davante. And I just, the Tennessee offense, I feel like there's other guys that can score big touchdowns and like keep Henry's production at bay because they're scoring quickly.
Yeah.
So I guess that's like my slight lean. But I ideally, like, I'm not opposed to trying to jam them both. So
right, yeah, the highest owned mid-tier guy is going to be Marvin Jones, and then like Justin Jefferson, kind of followed by him, as kind of like a mid-high tier guy.
yeah.
Actually, before we get to Jones, though, like in small field stuff, like what percentage of teams do you think play Devontae and Derrick Henry?
15-20%.
Yeah. So if they're and to back out of that,
This is riveting television. You working on a calculator.
Yeah, I'm doing it wrong too. So don't even worry about it.
But I think
that's like about them being about 45% owned each, assuming there's no correlation to them being used together.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Maybe it's higher. I don't know, but I don't know. It's 2 roster spots out of 8. Like you can do other stuff still.
Yeah, it is very high for 2 very expensive guys. I was just curious your thoughts. Jones is, I think, pretty shaky as very chalk. I feel like I'm betting on Levitan here a little bit, where I think he's a very good play in a vacuum, but I also think that the concerns around him do come to fruition a little bit more when you're talking, the second highest owned receiver on both sides.
Can you tell me what's going on with Josh Reynolds? Because wasn't it like 2 weeks ago that like Van Jefferson like randomly played like all the time and Josh Reynolds didn't play at all, and nobody's hurt there, right?
Cup has COVID.
Oh, Cup has COVID. That's what it is. Okay.
So
I didn't see anybody on the injury report, which
So Cup has COVID. Reynolds, led the team in targets last week with 10. He did have that one weird week with Jefferson, but Jefferson played 14 snaps to Reynolds' 648 last week. So that's what's going on with the Josh Reynolds cheap chalk. Him and McCole Hardman seem like secondary cheap chalk, and Chenault as probably the chalkiest of the cheap guys, at least on DraftKings. On FanDuel, Chenault is like more in line with the rest because his PPR prowess is better on DK. So any thoughts on Marvin or those cheap receivers?
Marvin, I think the ownership will be highly dependent on Stafford, because I do think people will back off if it's not Stafford. I'm probably not playing. It's certainly if I'm playing like Adams, if I'm trying to jam Adams and Henry, I'm not playing Marvin, certainly on those teams. Like right off the bat, if you jam Adams and Henry, you need to start getting contrarian pretty quickly. And so I would cut him out there. I'll probably be below field on him on both spots. I like Cooks because I like correlating with Henry, and I think that's one of the easier ways to do it. And I don't mind some of the Carolina receiving options, Curtis Samuel, DJ Moore, and whatnot. But those guys, their ownerships aren't great either.
Yeah. So I mean, like, which of the receivers are you least or most likely to play of the cheap guys of like Chenault, Hardman, Reynolds?
I'm probably least likely to play. I think I'm least likely to play Reynolds.
Yeah, that one hurts me. I'll probably try and correlate what I do.
It just seems like a spot where, especially like at that price, you can find like alternatives that are getting similar workloads at almost no ownership. Like the Keelan Cole from Reynolds thing seems like, especially when it's a little bit of leverage on LaVisca, that seems like a really easy pivot.
Well, but you can kind of make the same argument for all those guys. Like there's a cheap pivot for all three of those guys with the same volume. I think for me, I'm least likely to play Hardman unless I do Charger stacks. I think his upside's more untapped with like Mahomes. So even if he's getting more volume or more snaps, it's not necessarily great. And I think he's the guy I'm most likely to fade of that group. Tight end, there's not like super heavy chalk. We have Kittle right now as the highest owned tight end, and he came out and he was George Kittle right away last week. It was a Saturday game, so people didn't see it a lot, but he played 50% of the snaps right away. Saw 5 targets, turned that into 4 for 92. And there's no Ayuk, there's no Debo, so the ceiling is great on Kittle. I don't think anyone's ownership gets out of control at tight end though this week.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that.
Okay, so we'll go to contrarian ideas then, based off what we said. And again, there's so many this week that we'll try and dig into our favorites. We're not going to touch everybody. It's a 15-game slate, so there are guys we don't touch that are going to be in play. That's the nature of the week. I think for me, like up top, I think Eckler and David Montgomery are somewhat interesting as they're very live if they just beat Jonathan Taylor or Derrick Henry, like in terms of per dollar value. Like they're live right away, even if they don't have amazing weeks, which is weird to say on a really large week. So I think they're interesting up top. I think mid-tier, if I'm thinking like pure ceiling, DeAndre Swift, Jeff Wilson, kind of stick out. Jeff Wilson's been very close to some huge games. I think people are afraid of the price uptick, but they've been workhorse loading Jeff Wilson, in a backfield that has had super high fantasy outcomes, like collectively over the past 2 seasons.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree with those guys in terms of kind of the upper mid tier. No disagreements there.
Ronald Jones and Josh Jacobs in that mid tier, like guys that I could see scoring multiple touchdowns pretty easily.
Yeah, I think it's possible. I'm a little bit more on the Tampa Bay passing game, but Ronald Jones at 3%, like I can't really deny that in any way, shape, or form. So totally fine by me too. And Josh Jacobs, again, that Vegas Denver game, I don't think there's a ton of ownership there.
If we want to get into the Malcolm Brown pivots, Dare, Ty Johnson, Rodney Smith, Nyheim Hines is kind of a double dip as leverage off Malcolm Brown, leverage off Jonathan Taylor, but you probably could be used with Taylor, quite frankly. I think those guys are interesting. Also curious your thoughts on Mike Boone on FanDuel as leverage off. Like, what if we just misread this Madison situation?
Yeah.
Concussion after appendectomy. Mike Boone's like the stone min there.
Yeah. I don't mind taking shots on it in larger field stuff. In small field stuff, I don't think it's necessary, but in larger field stuff, playing like 5 to 7, 8% of Mike Boone at that price on FanDuel totally makes sense, because even if you miss on the workload, he could like run into 2 touchdowns, just like if it's the situation where he happens to be in on the drive, they're splitting the workload. You don't need him to have like the dominant workload to pay off on FanDuel, because FanDuel you can pay off on like, good touchdown variants. So
I know you mentioned like in Melvin Gordon. There's also like David Johnson's in weird pricing flux. I think I'm out on DJ this week, but once again, it's a great Houston, Tennessee game. So your thoughts on DJ?
I like DJ probably more than you do, but I'm more likely to play the Houston passing game side of that equation. Tennessee's defense.
Watson this week?
Yeah, I'm open to that. Yeah. Tennessee's defense has just been a disaster. So like I have no issues. I mean, teams are going up and down the field on them all the time. So I have no issues playing anyone from Houston, really.
Okay, so at wide receiver, I know quite often we're looking at, we sort on value and not raw projection. I do think it's a good week this week to sort on raw projection and see guys that aren't going to be too owned, because you can find some cap relief guys that make anything work. Some of the guys that stick out, it's really just the guys that aren't the chalk guys. Thielen, AJ Brown, Metcalf, Ridley to an extent, Allen Robinson if you want to correlate. So those guys stick out a little bit. I know the show guys really like Metcalf in this spot. His price tag has finally fallen into the mid 7s, where on FanDuel, low 7s on DraftKings, where a couple weeks we were like, I like it in theory, but low 8,000s is a lot. So it's finally dropped. In the mid tier, I mentioned Higgins and Landry in the stack section. I think Hollywood Brown is somewhat interesting. They've really condensed the target share recently for Baltimore. Our man T. Higgins still there, even with Tyler Boyd back. The Cowboys trio looks like it's going to go overlooked after they went completely nuclear last week. And then there's this slew of cheap guys. We've gone over Keelan Cole. There's the Bills guys and Gabriel Davis McKenzie if you kind of want to swing for the fences. Michael Pittman looks great to me right now. He practiced in full. We have him projected super megalo own. Richie James, Slayton, Marquez Callaway maybe. There's a lot of guys you can go to. Anything you like in particular?
I like Big Mike Williams.
Big Mike.
Same sort of, situation as last week, but now you've got a team in Kansas City that, you can only rest so many guys in terms of like the inactives report. So you might not see a lot of primary defensive players on the inactives report, but it wouldn't surprise me to see a lot of the starters not getting the snaps and their snap shares coming down quite a bit. And so I still think, I know they spread it out last week, but he had 10 targets. So
yeah, I
he's
think
not going to be owned.
You can make the argument it's actually a better spot than last week because we're more confident of the volume funneling to him than we were heading into last week. But the ownership is going to be lower. So I like to make Williams play quite a bit. Tight end, one of the guys I like a lot is Cole Kmet as a cheap tight end coming back on Green Bay stuff, or just if you need a cap filler. We're not projecting him for much ownership on either site. And I know last week was infuriating if you played Cole Kmet. As you can see, Cole Kmet and Jimmy Graham. Kmet 6 targets, 90% of the snaps. Graham half the amount of snaps, 1 less target, but Graham has 4 catches and 2 touchdowns for a nice 69 yards. Kmet 2 for 18. But if we're being process oriented, I mean, this is the same Kmet that was super chalky for a couple of weeks. It's just people are kind of following the production. But if you look at the last 5 games, 87% snap share, 15% targets, I'm still buying Cole Kmet.
Yeah, I think there's good reasons to still buy there. I think just a lot of the same reasons that you like Marquise Brown in terms of the target share condensing. It's also been that way for Mark Andrews a little bit with the opportunities, and they're obviously they're trying, they're needing to win to secure their playoff spot. He's one of these guys that, of the guys that has a ceiling relative to his position, is on a team that is intentionally contending for something. He's one of the few guys that's not getting ownership projected along with it. Like most of those guys carry ownership along with it. Jonathan Taylor, Derrick Henry, Devontae Adams, so on and so forth. Andrews is not getting the ownership kind of along with it. So I think he's very interesting. I think Ingram is still interesting. They're another team that's playing to try to win to get in. I think Daniel Jones is an interesting cheap quarterback, and I think Ingram's the best way to correlate him. So if you're considering that route, I think he's in play even though he's projecting for some ownership.
Yeah, I honestly think you could go back to Parham. I know it was a little frustrating last week, but he was actually on the field quite a bit. Steven Anderson out-targeted him, which was, annoying and a little bit of a surprise.
With 15% snap share. Oh, that's not fair.
Sorry, I brought up the wrong one. But yeah, 44% snap share, 6 targets, whereas Parham, twice the amount of snaps, only 3 targets, but he converted his into 2 for 47. I think Parham's interesting. Also, you mentioned Mark Andrews. I'm giving myself a victory lap on, closing line value if we're going to. I took some heat, Drew, for touting Baltimore Ravens as a Super Bowl at 25-1 a few weeks ago, and they're like half that now. So buzz off, people.
Sklansky Bucks. They're
Bucks. I'm taking up.
Also, if everybody likes this Minnesota passing game, maybe we should like Irv Smith a little bit.
Yeah, Irv seems
like
totally fine.
They run a lot of stuff in the red zone specifically for him. So I think he's very much in play in tournaments as well.
Okay, flag plants. It's that time. Or actually, I'll say one other thing at tight end. Like I think Higbee, Everett on the Rams as like leverage off the other Rams guys. They might get utilized a bit more. Who knows how much Van Jefferson they're going to play. I think both those guys are interesting at tight end. Okay, flag plants. Drew, I think I know who yours is, but I'll throw to you. I think I know your first one.
Yeah, I have one, and I need to come up with a second. But my first one is Big Mike Williams. I really think this is the same or better spot than last week. I guess you could argue, Denver was a much worse secondary than Kansas City, but I don't know what we're going to have out there in terms of Kansas City from a starter's perspective. And it's this is like my range for week 17 in general. I think we all get so focused on trying to identify the like sub 4K options and which are the best are those. And they're all a little bit fragile. And I think the guys that are like right around 5K tend to get overlooked and not talked about as much because we're spending so much time talking about the other situations, and they tend to get under-owned. I think Herbert stacks are certainly still viable. I think you could play Herbert, Parham, Mike Williams. You can bring it back. You don't necessarily need to bring it back. But I think just in general, in terms of builds and ways that I'm like looking at things, I think a lot of these mid-tier guys that are like kind of rolling around in ownership are going to come in like sub 10%. And these are established NFL players that have big opportunities in front of them. And I'd rather bet on those than the shaky workload situations that we're kind of guessing at that people are trying to figure out. So like, I don't mind building more balanced in general. And Big Mike Williams is a big part of that for me this weekend.
I'm going to piggyback. I'm going to actually switch up kind of what I intended. I'm going to go Justin Herbert stacks, piggybacking off your Mike Williams. I think in the small field stuff I play, you can onslaught him because the prices are so good. Even Jalen Guyton had the targets, where we wanted. That's 2 weeks in a row for a big play guy who's super cheap. We mentioned Parham. Like you can triple him pretty easily, and then that gets you in the high owned studs, but that's sort of okay at that point. So I'm going to go with Justin Herbert stacks. He doesn't look like he's going to carry. He's not going to be the chalk quarterback. Let's put it that way. He's not going to be low owned, but he's not going to be the chalk quarterback.
I like Herbert. I like it. I've come up with a second flag plan. I'm just kind of defaulting to my cover boy on leverage, but we didn't talk about him very much. I think he's going to have some ownership, but not substantial ownership. And I really don't think he's a different play than Jonathan Taylor, but I don't think he's that far different from Jonathan Taylor, and that's Nick Chubb. In the sense that like big favorites, big implied total. The difference is obviously that Taylor of late has clearly separated from his backfield, and Chubb is not going to separate from Kareem Hunt. Kareem Hunt's going to be there. But we've seen the Steelers defense wilt to opposing running backs of late. Jonathan Taylor scored twice against them last week. We also don't know who the Steelers are going to play defensively in terms of their snaps because they're showing a clear rest indication with the status of Ben Roethlisberger. And I think the ownership on Chubb, because the price tag is so annoying and the projection is hard to get there, I think the ownership has a ceiling of like 12 to 15%. And I think it's got a floor of like 5 to 7%. That gets pretty interesting. So, and Chubb is a guy that can break off really, really big runs. So I like Nick Chubb in tournaments this week, especially if you're like fading the Derrick Henry, Jonathan Taylor range. I would rather play Nick Chubb than Austin Eckler for like pure upside in tournaments.
Yeah, I think those two are pretty close, but I understand the Chubb upside play. I'm going to go. Casey called out my flag plan. I'm going to stick with it though, because I've been looking forward to the Jeff Wilson Jr. flag plan, which I think he has like top 3 RB upside, quite frankly, on the week. They utilized him in the passing game last week. And again, just time and time again, this backfield, we've seen huge touchdown total games, in single games at times based on like who the guy is. And we actually know who the guy is, going into the game. I guess he only had 2 targets last week. I thought he had a little bit more than that. But to get a 22 rush attempt game in the San Francisco running game is huge. And Drew's a little weary over how much Seattle's going to try in this game, especially in the second half. So if we get defensive starters rested too, that looks pretty good. So I'm with you, Casey, on the flag plan. And that's that's it. We're going to still be doing the show for the postseason, correct, Drew? Or are we not?
Yeah, no, we're gonna still do it. I'm gonna grind through the postseason show. The only reason that we're gonna still do it in the postseason is because we have mutually agreed that there will be no Frank Gore discussion during the postseason.
Well, I haven't agreed to that. I don't know where the mutual came from. But we'll have to communicate the timing to you guys on that because obviously, I guess it's possible.
Same time, same place, same time.
Same place, same time. We got the triple header starting at 1 o'clock. That's going to be a tight squeeze.
So we will lead right into inactives.
Nice.
You're working anyway. So
same place, same time. You heard it. All right. Thanks so much for following us all season. I know you guys are all subs, but if you like and subscribe to the YouTube page, it still helps us out. So if you've enjoyed Drew and I's work, let us know. And good luck this week, everyone.